It was the year 1305, and the bustling streets of London were filled with the usual sounds, vendors shouting over one another to sell their goods, the rhythmic pounding of hooves on stone roads, and the chatter of early morning merchants preparing for the day's trade. But this August morning was different. A darker, heavier sound would soon rise above the daily noise, the deafening cries of a blood-hungry mob assembling to witness one of the most infamous executions in recorded history. The man they had come to watch perish was William Wallace, the Scottish knight who had dared to rise against English dominance and inspired his people to unite under a common cause. But what unfolded that day was no simple execution, it was an elaborate performance of calculated brutality, constructed to annihilate not just Wallace the man, but everything he stood for. Modern popular culture, through films and patriotic legends, has often painted Wallace's final hours as gallant and quick, a heroic end for a freedom fighter. Yet, the real story was far more chilling. King Edward I, known by the nickname Longshanks, had designed Wallace's fate not merely as revenge, but as a grim proclamation that would echo for centuries. This was to be no ordinary death. This was intended as a nightmarish public lesson, a vivid warning carved in blood for anyone contemplating defiance against English rule. The method chosen was the most agonizing punishment medieval English law had devised: hanging, drawing, and quartering. This was a sentence not just to kill, but to utterly annihilate a person's spirit, body, and legacy. It was a sentence reserved for those declared traitors to the crown, men whose deaths were required to be slow, public, and unforgettable. This wasn't justice. It was a performance of dominance meant to crush hope and terrify hearts. Today, we peel away the veil of myth and confront the disturbing truth of what happened to William Wallace on that fateful day. To grasp the full weight of his fate, we must first understand the volatile and violent world that gave rise to his resistance. Great, here is part 2 of the rewritten version, maintaining the same tone, meaning, and length. To comprehend the depths of Wallace's suffering and the symbolic power of his death, we must first step into the fractured world of medieval Scotland in the late 1200s and early 1300s. This was not yet a unified nation in the modern sense. It was a land caught in a constant tug-of-war between dreams of self-rule and the harsh grip of foreign domination. Loyalty was fluid, often based more on necessity and survival than on patriotic ideals. The wars of Scottish independence erupted after a succession crisis created a power vacuum, an opportunity King Edward I of England quickly seized. He didn't view Scotland as a separate kingdom but as a disobedient province that required firm control. His ambitions were clear: subdue Scotland and bring it under direct English governance. Out of this political chaos rose William Wallace, not a noble seeking courtly power, but a lesser landowner who had been personally wounded by English oppression. Wallace's revolt was not born from a quest for fame, but from rage and loss. English forces had ravaged his family and homeland, and when he took up arms at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, it was with both vengeance and vision. That victory at Stirling wasn't just a military triumph, it was a rallying cry. Wallace had shown that the supposedly unstoppable English cavalry could be brought low. It ignited a belief that Scottish freedom was possible, not just a fading dream whispered in secret. But Edward I was no stranger to rebellion. He had crushed Welsh uprisings with ruthless efficiency and expelled England's Jewish population in a sweeping act of intolerance. He knew rebellion was like a spark: if left unchecked, it could ignite an inferno. Wallace's defiance wasn't something to simply defeat, it needed to be discredited, destroyed, and turned into a legend of warning. To Edward, Wallace had to become more than a vanquished foe. He had to become an example. By 1305, most of Scotland's noble families had bent the knee to English rule. Many saw compromise as a path to survival rather than obliteration. Wallace's continued resistance now made him a liability, not just to the English, but to his own people's fragile peace. He was a reminder of what they had abandoned. His defiance embarrassed the aristocrats who had chosen submission. Silencing him became a political necessity. The hunt for Wallace stretched across years. It was a relentless campaign carried out through an expanding web of spies, double agents, and frightened collaborators. Edward offered a generous bounty for Wallace's capture, and his network in Scotland worked tirelessly to isolate the rebel from any remaining allies. And, as with so many betrayals throughout history, Wallace's downfall came from within. In August of 1305, William Wallace was finally taken. Near the outskirts of Glasgow, he was captured, most likely betrayed by Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had pledged loyalty to the English. The precise details remain obscured by time and conflicting sources, but the result was undeniable: the face of Scottish resistance was now in English hands. News of Wallace's capture spread quickly, reaching London like a victorious battle report. To King Edward I, this was more than a military success, it was the first step in a calculated campaign to humiliate and destroy Wallace in full view of the world. The real punishment had only just begun. The journey from Scotland to London was crafted as a slow-motion degradation. Wallace was shackled, heavily guarded, and paraded through towns along the way, turned into a moving exhibit for English subjects eager to see the infamous rebel. The psychological toll was immense. He wasn't merely being transported, he was being publicly dismantled, piece by piece, long before his execution ever began. It was theater by design. A hero reduced to a display. A symbol reduced to a spectacle. By the time he arrived in London, Wallace had endured weeks of psychological torment. But the end was still ahead. His trial, held at Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305, was never meant to be fair. It was a ceremony wrapped in the robes of justice, designed to legitimize the already decided verdict. Conducted entirely in Latin, a language Wallace likely didn't speak fluently, the trial was more about optics than law. He was charged with treason, murder, sacrilege, arson, and a list of other crimes. The most damning charge, treason, was almost laughable in its hypocrisy. Wallace had never accepted Edward I as his sovereign. He had never sworn loyalty to the English crown. When offered the chance to speak, Wallace reportedly stood firm and declared that he could not be guilty of treason, for he had never been Edward's subject. That brief moment of defiance only confirmed what was already set in stone. The outcome of the trial was a foregone conclusion. Every judge presiding had been handpicked by Edward himself. There was no possibility of clemency, no consideration for Wallace's motives or the justice of his cause. The trial existed to justify the brutality that would follow. Each charge was tailored to match the punishment. Treason demanded hanging, drawing, and quartering, the most savage form of execution in England's legal arsenal. The added accusations of murder and sacrilege were not about truth, but about narrative. They painted Wallace as a common criminal, not a fallen commander. They stripped him of nobility, casting him not as a warrior but as a monster. English law had become a weapon, and Wallace was the target. Then came the pronouncement of his sentence: he would be dragged through London, hanged but not killed, disemboweled while alive, beheaded, and his body quartered, each piece sent to a different part of Scotland. Every phase of this punishment had a dark symbolic weight. The dragging symbolized humiliation, the hanging his spiritual rejection, the evisceration his inner corruption, and the quartering his erasure from the world. This wasn't just a death, it was a dismemberment of body, soul, and symbol. The morning of August 23, 1305, dawned under clear skies as the city of London braced for an event unlike any other. Word had spread for days: William Wallace, the rebel who had defied the English crown, was to be executed in a manner so brutal it would etch itself into the minds of all who witnessed it. Authorities had gone to great lengths to ensure the spectacle matched the message. Temporary wooden scaffolds were erected, vantage points secured, and vendors set up stalls selling meat pies, ale, and sweetbread. This wasn't merely a punishment, it was a civic celebration, a carnival of cruelty where justice and entertainment fused into one macabre display. Wallace, already stripped of his dignity, was now stripped of his clothes. His wrists and ankles were bound tightly to a hurdle, a wooden platform attached to a team of horses. The frame would drag his body across the city's stone streets from the Tower of London to the execution site at Smithfield. The path had been deliberately chosen to cut through London's most crowded districts, ensuring maximum exposure and public degradation. As he was pulled along the jagged roads, his skin was torn and battered, leaving a gruesome trail of blood in his wake. The crowds that lined the streets were a mix of the curious, the loyal, and the cruel. Some had come out of patriotic fervor, others for amusement, and many simply to say they had seen it. It was not uncommon in medieval England for executions to draw thousands. These were public rituals, sanctioned by the crown and embedded in the cultural fabric as grim reminders of the king's dominion. And for Wallace, every step was agony. The jeering of the crowd grew louder as he passed, fueled by officials who encouraged the ridicule. People threw rotten food and shouted insults. Children joined in, mimicking the cruelty of their elders. What they witnessed was not just a man being punished, it was the systematic stripping of humanity, orchestrated with chilling precision. Wallace said nothing. Accounts from that day describe him as eerily silent, his eyes fixed on something unseen, his mouth unmoving despite the torment. Some would later interpret this as stoic resistance, others as the catatonia of a man pushed beyond pain. But whatever the truth, Wallace did not cry out, did not beg. He endured in silence, which only added to the legend he would become. By the time the procession reached Smithfield, the crowd had swelled. The field, long used for executions, had been transformed into a twisted festival. Merchants sold refreshments, jugglers entertained children, and people jostled for the best view. It was a grotesque pageant, one that blurred the line between punishment and public revelry. The scaffold stood tall, built specifically for this moment. At its base waited the executioner, a man well versed in pain, with a collection of tools meant for a precise and prolonged performance. William Wallace was about to meet his end, not in silence, but surrounded by cheers, laughter, and the smells of cooked meat and spilled beer. The executioner approached William Wallace with calm precision. This was a man well practiced in cruelty, someone whose profession depended on turning human agony into procedure. His tools gleamed under the morning sun, hooks, knives, and blades each designed to inflict maximum suffering while prolonging life just enough to complete the spectacle. The first act began with the hanging. Wallace was hoisted by the neck, the rope stretched tight but deliberately measured, not enough to snap the spine, but enough to cause slow, excruciating suffocation. His face darkened to a deep purple, his limbs jerked involuntarily, and his chest heaved in desperation. The crowd roared as he writhed, caught in the grotesque dance of slow death. But before unconsciousness could overtake him, the rope was cut. He collapsed to the platform, gasping, coughing, alive and aware. That was the point. What followed next remains one of the most sadistic rituals of public punishment ever recorded. Wallace was laid flat, his arms and legs restrained. The executioner took a curved blade and began to slice open his abdomen. There was no anesthesia, no mercy. The man who had once inspired an army was now laid bare, screaming as his flesh was pulled apart. One by one, the executioner reached inside and removed Wallace's organs, intestines, liver, stomach, each torn from his body and held high for the audience to see. The onlookers shouted in approval, raising their tankards in toast as the organs were tossed into a fire built beside the scaffold. The smoke carried the scent of burning flesh into the air, mingling with the sounds of laughter and casual conversation. To medieval minds, this wasn't just physical destruction. The organs, especially the bowels, were thought to house emotion and virtue. Burning them while Wallace remained alive was a symbolic act, meant to unmake him not only as a man, but as a moral being. It was a ritual dehumanization. Despite everything, Wallace remained conscious. His eyes were still open, still aware, as his body was systematically dismantled. Some chroniclers claimed he tried to speak, though no one knows what he said. Others believed he prayed silently, or locked his gaze on the heavens. Regardless of what was true, Wallace did not give his tormentors the satisfaction of pleas or tears. Eventually, after this long and calculated torture, the final act began. The executioner lifted an axe and, with a single practiced swing, severed Wallace's head. Blood spilled over the wooden scaffold, and at last, his suffering ended. But the performance was far from over. His severed head was held aloft, its mouth slightly agape, the crowd erupting in applause and shouts. It was a gruesome trophy, destined to serve as a warning. His body was next. The limbs were methodically sliced from the torso, arms and legs hacked away, then raised for the crowd like butcher's meat. The dismembered remains were not meant for burial. They were meant for exhibition. The final chapter of Wallace's punishment was as calculated as the torture that preceded it. His remains were not granted rest, nor any form of respect. Instead, they became instruments of terror, pieces of a political message sent across the kingdom like grim letters carved in flesh. His head, still oozing blood, was dipped in tar, a common preservation technique used for public displays. Once prepared, it was placed atop a tall iron spike and mounted prominently on London Bridge. There it remained for years, its blackened skull peering down on those who passed beneath, a grotesque landmark visible to anyone entering the city from the south. It wasn't merely a deterrent. It was propaganda in its most visceral form. But the desecration didn't end with the head. The 4/4 of Wallace's body, his limbs severed and wrapped for travel, were each sent to strategic locations across Scotland, Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. These cities were chosen carefully. They were hubs of Scottish life, once supportive of Wallace's cause or vulnerable to further rebellion. The message was clear: rebellion ends not in glory, but in mutilation. At every stop, his remains were displayed in public squares or nailed to gates, a rotting testament to English authority. For the people of those cities, Wallace's dismembered body became both a horror and a symbol. Children walked past his legs nailed to a wall. Merchants sold goods in the shadow of his decaying arms. Each sight served as a reminder: this is what becomes of those who defy the crown. It was psychological warfare on a national scale. And for a while, it worked. In the immediate aftermath of Wallace's execution, resistance appeared to falter. Many of his supporters vanished into exile or submitted to Edward's authority. The brutality had done its job, it had frightened a nation into silence. Or so Edward thought. In reality, the execution had the opposite effect on many Scots. Rather than erasing Wallace's legacy, the horror of his death elevated it. He was no longer just a rebel leader, he had become a martyr. A man who had endured the worst punishments the English could devise, yet never begged for mercy, never renounced his cause. One such man deeply affected by Wallace's fate was Robert the Bruce. A Scottish noble who had previously played both sides in the conflict, Bruce reportedly found renewed purpose in Wallace's suffering. The execution revealed to him the true nature of English rule, not just conquest, but humiliation. And from that understanding, Bruce would eventually rise to lead a renewed fight for Scottish independence. The lesson was clear: surrender did not bring peace. It brought degradation. Though the spectacle of William Wallace's execution was designed to crush Scottish spirit, it had the unintended effect of igniting a deeper, more defiant resolve. Edward I had sought to destroy a symbol. Instead, he had created a legend. Across Scotland, stories of Wallace's torment began to spread, not through official proclamations, but by word of mouth, whispered in taverns, shared in village squares, and passed down from father to son. The gruesome details, meant to instill fear, became fuel for a collective rage. The brutality had stripped Wallace of his flesh, but not of his influence. A subtle but undeniable transformation took place in the hearts of the Scottish people. They began to see Wallace not just as a warrior, but as a martyr, someone who had endured unspeakable agony without ever surrendering. His silence during his final hours, his refusal to bow, became acts of defiance more powerful than any sword. Future Scottish fighters took this lesson to heart. They understood now that surrender offered no safety, no dignity. Captured rebels weren't merely killed, they were paraded, tortured, and erased. This knowledge shifted the very nature of Scottish warfare. Gone were the expectations of chivalric conduct or negotiations. What emerged was a grimmer, more desperate form of resistance, a mindset where death in battle was preferable to capture, and survival meant never being taken alive. It birthed a new code among the rebels: no quarter asked, and none given. This hardened worldview helped shape the campaigns of Robert the Bruce. The horror of Wallace's fate hung over every decision. Bruce knew that English mercy was a myth. He fought not for peace under Edward's terms, but for total freedom, a vision Wallace had died for and that Bruce would carry forward. But Wallace's death echoed beyond Scotland. In other corners of Europe, monarchs and foreign diplomats took note of the execution. What they saw was not simply the crushing of a rebellion but the naked brutality of English justice. The extremity of the punishment, its methodical cruelty, gave England a reputation that extended beyond military might. It became known as a realm where political dissent was met with ceremonial torture. That legacy would complicate England's international relationships in the years that followed. Rather than demonstrating strength, Edward had revealed his empire's capacity for savagery. The lesson wasn't lost on foreign powers who now questioned whether alliances with England came with an unseen cost. The attempt to erase Wallace had instead immortalized him. The execution of William Wallace left behind not just a cultural wound, but a remarkably detailed paper trail. Unlike many medieval events lost to myth or distortion, Wallace's final hours were meticulously recorded, both by those who orchestrated them and by those who bore witness. These documents would go on to shape how history remembered him, sometimes with cold accuracy, other times with romantic distortion. One of the most telling sources is the Lanercost Chronicle, penned by English monks. Though naturally biased toward the English view, it offered chillingly clinical descriptions of Wallace's punishment, his trial, the public's reaction, and the duration of his suffering. The tone is distant, but the detail is unmistakable. To the English, this was a necessary display of power, carefully catalogued to affirm their version of justice. But Scottish records painted a very different picture. Texts like the Chronicle of John of Verdun presented Wallace not as a criminal but as a martyr, a man of unshakable conviction who met death with solemn dignity. These accounts leaned toward hagiography, emphasizing his silence, his courage, and his defiance in the face of unimaginable torment. They recast his execution not as a defeat, but as a sacred offering to the cause of liberty. Such differing perspectives reveal the deep fracture Wallace's story left in the historical consciousness. One man, two legacies, tyrant or hero, traitor or martyr. And yet, beyond the chronicles and national myth-making, it was the English state's own legal records that offered the clearest, and most damning, picture. Preserved in national archives, these documents detailed every phase of the process, from the charges levied against Wallace, to the logistics of his dismemberment, to the final destinations of his body parts. Nothing was left to chance. This was not a spontaneous punishment, but a blueprint for controlled savagery. Every step was designed for effect. Eyewitnesses, both English and Scottish, added further layers to the account. Some described Wallace's composure with awe, remarking that he never cried out. Others focused on the crowd, whose delight in the suffering bordered on hysteria. To some, it was justice. To others, it was barbarism. But to all, it was unforgettable. In a time before mass communication, Wallace's death achieved something rare. It became a defining historical event witnessed by thousands, preserved in writing, and passed down through centuries. And though the records intended to destroy his name, they instead helped solidify his legacy. William Wallace's death was meant to end something. To extinguish resistance, to silence rebellion, to erase the memory of defiance. But instead, it birthed something far more enduring, a symbol. Over the centuries that followed, Wallace's story evolved into myth. What had begun as a brutal historical event transformed into a foundational legend of Scottish identity. His gruesome execution, meant to terrify, instead galvanized. His silence in the face of torture, his refusal to acknowledge the authority of a foreign king, became marks of heroism passed down through generations. This transformation wasn't accidental. It was nurtured, first by oral traditions, then by chroniclers, poets, and eventually, filmmakers. Songs were sung of his bravery. Tales of his final moments were told beside hearths in Highland cottages. His suffering was reimagined not just as tragedy, but as sacred sacrifice. In the bleak aftermath of his death, Wallace had become something larger than himself. A martyr for freedom. The legend influenced every generation of Scots that followed. During later uprisings, his name was invoked by rebels seeking legitimacy and purpose. His story offered not just history, but moral clarity, the idea that it was better to suffer and die with dignity than to live under the boot of tyranny. But Wallace's legacy didn't end at Scotland's borders. In the centuries that followed, as the world began to grapple with ideas of natural rights, sovereignty, and justice, Wallace's execution was increasingly viewed not just as a medieval atrocity, but as a violation of something deeper, human dignity itself. Legal scholars in later periods would cite Wallace's torture and public execution as an example of state cruelty that stood in stark contrast to emerging principles of due process and humane treatment. The very excess of his punishment became evidence of injustice. His case was studied not for its political outcome, but for what it revealed about unchecked power and the dangers of legal systems built to serve tyrants. In the realm of culture, Wallace's martyrdom became the subject of countless artistic expressions, paintings, ballads, stage plays, and eventually cinema. These retellings were not always historically accurate, but accuracy was never the point. What mattered was the message, that there are causes greater than life, and that suffering for principle can be more powerful than victory. The execution had failed in its purpose. Edward I had hoped to destroy a man and a movement. Instead, he had ensured that Wallace would never be forgotten. The execution of William Wallace was more than the death of a man. It was a defining moment that laid bare the terrible fragility of justice in a world ruled by fear and ambition. The method chosen, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was not only a punishment, it was a declaration. It told every subject of Edward I that rebellion would be met with pain, spectacle, and obliteration. Yet what the English crown failed to grasp was the power of memory. Wallace's name outlived his flesh. His dismembered body rotted on walls and gates, but the story of his suffering took root in the soul of a nation. His legacy was not in military victories, but in the image of a man who faced death without bowing. The horrors of his final day became a rallying cry, a sacred tale passed down not as a warning, but as inspiration. In modern times, Wallace's death stands as a grim mirror held up to civilization. We are forced to confront the truth that cruelty is not an aberration of history, it is a tool often sharpened by law, ritual, and public acceptance. The crowd that cheered his torture was not made up of monsters, but of citizens convinced they were watching justice unfold. It is a haunting reminder of how quickly societies can normalize brutality when it is sanctioned by the state. Even the executioner, whose skilled hands pulled Wallace apart, was no demon, he was a functionary of a system designed to destroy threats not only physically, but ideologically. The bureaucrats who planned the event did so with precision and pride, believing they were preserving order. But what they preserved, perhaps unintentionally, was the image of a man destroyed for refusing to kneel. Over time, Wallace came to symbolize the eternal conflict between tyranny and liberty. Not because he won, but because he suffered. Because in the face of unspeakable pain, he did not yield. His death was so grotesque, so complete, that it became something sacred, a story not of defeat, but of endurance. Even now, centuries later, his execution forces us to reckon with uncomfortable truths about power, fear, and the cost of principle. In our modern world, comfortable, connected, and free in ways Wallace could not have imagined, it is easy to forget that those freedoms were built on the bones of people who chose to suffer rather than surrender. His sacrifice was not clean. It was not quick. But it was transformative. Today, when we speak of human rights, dignity, and freedom, we speak in echoes, echoes of blood cried into the stone streets of London. Echoes of a man torn apart, not for what he did, but for what he represented. William Wallace died without compromise. And in doing so, he became more than a rebel. He became a message. A message that even when the body is broken, the idea, freedom, dignity, defiance, cannot be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Not truly. Not forever.